The ballroom smelled of champagne and expensive mistakes. Victoria Bennett stood beside a marble column, her fingers wrapped so tightly around the stem of her wine glass that she half expected it to shatter. The crystal felt cold against her palm, grounding her to a moment she desperately wanted to escape. Around her, Portland's elites swirled in designer gowns and tailored suits, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the Grand Cascade Hotel, like the sound of a world she'd never quite belonged to. The chandelier overhead cast fractured light across the polished floor, and Victoria watched those fragments dance, wishing she could break apart just as easily and disappear into the cracks between the tiles. Her hair, pale blonde, almost silver under the artificial light, had been styled by her roommate Riley into an elegant twist that made her look sophisticated. Or at least that's what Riley had insisted, while working hairspray through the strands with determined efficiency. "You need to show him what he's missing," Riley had said, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd never had her heart carved out and left bleeding on a bedroom floor. "Walk in there like you own the place, like you've already moved on." But standing here now, surrounded by the city's most powerful and privileged, Victoria felt like a child playing dress-up in her mother's closet. The gown she wore was borrowed, the heels pinched her feet with every step, and the smile she'd forced onto her face for the past hour had long since crumbled into something that felt more like a grimace. Because across the room, beneath an archway, draped in white roses that cost more than her monthly rent, she could see him. Preston Calloway, her boyfriend of 3 years. Ex-boyfriend, she corrected herself, though the wound was still so fresh, too raw, the edges still bleeding every time she let herself think about what she'd lost. Or what she'd thought she'd lost before she discovered the truth about who Preston really was beneath the charming smile and expensive suits. He stood with his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. Sienna Lawford, Victoria's former friend, former colleague, former bridesmaid-to-be, back when Victoria had been foolish enough to believe that Preston was building towards something permanent, that the 3 years they'd spent together meant something more than convenient companionship and someone to bring to company events. They looked perfect together, Victoria realized, with a sick twist in her stomach that made the wine she'd been nursing taste like vinegar. Preston, with his dark hair perfectly styled, his designer suit fitting him like a second skin. Sienna in emerald silk that clung to her curves, her auburn hair swept up to expose the diamond earrings that caught the light with every movement of her head. Those earrings. Victoria's breath caught as recognition hit her like a physical blow. She'd seen them before in the window of a jewelry store downtown, had stood there with Preston one afternoon pointing them out, mentioning how beautiful they were, how the diamonds seemed to capture light and hold it, transforming it into something that looked like trapped stars. "Too expensive," Preston had his tone final dismissive. "We need to be practical, Tori. Save for the future." The future, what a joke that had been, because apparently the future he'd been saving for included spending a small fortune on jewelry for the woman he'd been sleeping with behind Victoria's back for the past 6 months. The woman who'd smiled to Victoria's face while planning dinner parties and girls' nights, all while texting Preston about hotel rooms and stolen afternoons. Victoria had discovered them 2 weeks ago, had come home early from a marketing conference in Seattle, exhausted from 3 days of networking and panel discussions, wanting nothing more than to collapse on her couch with takeout and mindless television. She'd opened the door to her own apartment to find Preston and Sienna tangled together on her bed, in her sheets, in the space she'd considered safe and sacred. The memory still had the power to make her feel like the floor was dropping out from under her feet. The way they'd both frozen guilt and shock written across their faces. The way Preston had scrambled to cover himself to offer explanations that sounded hollow even as they left his mouth. Sienna had just smiled, a small, satisfied curve of her lips that told Victoria everything she needed to know about how little their friendship had ever meant. Victoria had told them both to get out, had stood there in her doorway, shaking with rage and humiliation, while they gathered their clothes and made their exit with the kind of awkward haste that would have been funny if it hadn't been destroying her life. Then she locked the door, slid down against it until she was sitting on the floor, and cried until she couldn't breathe. That had been 2 weeks ago. 14 days of ignoring Preston's calls and messages, of deleting Sienna's attempts at explanation, without reading them, of lying to Riley about being fine, while spending every night staring at her ceiling and wondering what she'd done wrong, where she'd failed, why she hadn't been enough. This charity gala had been circled on their calendar for months. They were supposed to attend together, Preston's arm around her waist, his voice low in her ear, telling her she was beautiful. Instead, Victoria had come alone, forcing herself through the doors on nothing but pride, and Riley's insistence that hiding at home would only make the pain worse. "You show up," Riley had said, helping Victoria into the borrowed gown. "You show up looking amazing, and you show him that you're fine, that you've moved on, that he didn't break you." Except Victoria wasn't fine. She hadn't moved on. And standing here watching Preston laugh at something, Sienna whispered to him, seeing the way his hand moved familiarly on her back. Victoria felt so thoroughly broken that she wondered if all the pieces would ever fit back together again. They were moving through the crowd now, heading in her direction. Victoria's pulse spiked, panic flooding her system with the kind of adrenaline that made her want to run, to grab her coat and escape through the side entrance before they could reach her, before she had to face them and pretend to be civil. But her feet remained planted on the polished floor, her body refusing to cooperate with her mind's desperate commands to flee. Because beneath the fear and humiliation, something else burned. Something hot and bitter that tasted like rage. She'd done nothing wrong, she'd been loyal and supportive, and everything a partner was supposed to be. She'd celebrated Preston's promotions, listened to his complaints about difficult clients, planned her life around his schedule and his needs. And he'd repaid her by destroying everything they'd built together. She wouldn't run, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her retreat. If she had to stand here and face them, she'd do it with her head high and her voice steady, even if it killed her. "Staring won't change anything," Victoria whispered to herself, the words lost in the swell of music from the string quartet positioned near the massive windows overlooking the city. But she couldn't look away. Couldn't stop watching as they drew closer, their path through the crowd, inevitably intersecting with hers. That's when she felt him. A presence beside her, solid and grounding in a way that made the chaos of the ballroom seem to recede. Victoria turned her head and found herself looking up into a gaze so intense it seemed to pierce straight through her careful facade. The man was tall, impossibly so, with shoulders that seemed to fill the space around him. His face was all sharp angles and controlled power, the kind of features that belonged on ancient statues or monuments to warriors long dead. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than Victoria's car, tailored to perfection, moving with him like it was part of his body rather than something separate. But it was the way he stood that caught her attention. The absolute stillness of someone who never had to prove their strength, because everyone around them could feel it radiating like heat from a forge. People moved out of his way instinctively, their bodies responding to something primal before their minds even registered his presence. "You look like you need an ally tonight," he said. His voice was deep with a rough edge that suggested he didn't speak often or waste words on pleasantries. There was an intensity in the way he looked at her that made Victoria feel simultaneously exposed and strangely protected. "I'm fine," Victoria managed, though her voice shook enough to make the lie obvious. She took a sip of wine, trying to steady herself, trying to figure out who this man was and why he'd chosen to speak to her. In a room full of Portland's elite, she was nobody. A mid-level marketing coordinator at a design firm here on a ticket that cost half her monthly salary, wearing a dress that belonged to someone else. His attention shifted past her, and Victoria knew without looking that he'd spotted Preston and Sienna. When those penetrating eyes returned to her face, they held understanding that felt almost invasive, as if he could see straight through her careful facade to the humiliation festering underneath. "No," he said quietly, and there was almost gentleness beneath the steel in his tone. "You're not fine." The simple acknowledgement of her pain made Victoria's throat tighten. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall here now in front of this stranger and everyone else. Refused to give Preston and Sienna the satisfaction of seeing exactly how much damage they'd done. "It doesn't matter," Victoria said, forcing the words past the constriction in her chest. "Nothing I can do about it now." Before the stranger could respond, Victoria heard it. Sienna's laugh, high and practiced, closer than before. The sound cut through the music and conversation like a blade, and Victoria felt her carefully maintained composure crack. She couldn't face them. Not yet. Not with her control hanging by such a fragile thread. The stranger must have seen the flash of panic in her expression, because he shifted slightly. His body angled to partially block her view of the approaching couple, creating a barrier between Victoria and the source of her pain. I have a proposition, he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Something that might help with your immediate problem. What? Victoria barely managed the word. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, and the pulse points at her wrists. Let me be your ally tonight. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes suggested he understood humiliation more intimately than his powerful presence would indicate. Just for a few hours, let them see you've moved on. Victoria should have said no. Should have recognized the danger in accepting help from a stranger at a society event where appearances were everything and nothing was quite what it seemed. But Sienna's perfume reached her, then jasmine, and something expensive that probably cost more than Victoria's monthly rent. And she heard Preston's voice saying her name with that careful politeness people use when they want to appear civil while secretly hoping you'll just disappear. The stranger extended his hand to her palm, up offering rather than demanding. Trust me for one night, he said. That's all I'm asking. Victoria looked at that offered hand, at the long fingers and calloused palm that spoke of someone who worked with his hands, despite the expensive suit and obvious wealth. She looked up at his face, at the sharp angles and controlled power, and the intensity in his gaze that might have been loneliness. Someone who understood what it felt like to stand in a crowded room and feel utterly alone. Their eyes held, and in that moment Victoria made a choice born of pain and pride and reckless desperation. She took his hand, his fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and he pulled her gently away from the column she'd been using as shelter. The world seemed to sharpen around them, sounds growing clearer, colors more vivid, the weight of curious eyes turning in their direction. Tori, Preston's voice cut through the music, and Victoria felt the stranger's hand tighten fractionally on hers. A silent message of support, of strength, borrowed for as long as she needed it. Victoria turned, the stranger's hands still clasping hers, and faced the man she'd loved for 3 years. Up close, she could see the discomfort in Preston's expression, the way his jaw tightened when he noticed her hand in the stranger's grip. Sienna stood beside him in that emerald dress, those diamond earrings catching the light, her smile sharp enough to cut. Preston, Victoria said, proud that her voice came out steady and clear. Sienna. Sienna's smile widened, but there was a predatory quality in it now, an edge that made Victoria think of a cat playing with an injured bird. We didn't think you'd come, Sienna said, her tone dripping with false concern. After everything, I mean, it must be so difficult for you. The stranger's thumb brushed across Victoria's knuckles. Such a small gesture, barely noticeable, but somehow it steadied her, reminded her that she wasn't facing this alone, even if her ally was someone whose name she didn't even know. I'm perfectly fine, Victoria said, lifting her chin. She'd spent 3 years learning to read Preston's moods, to navigate his expectations, to make herself smaller so he could feel bigger. But she was done with that now, done with apologizing for taking up space. Actually, I'm having a wonderful evening. Preston's attention fixed on the man beside Victoria, and she watched his expression transform. Recognition flickered across his features, followed immediately by something that looked like genuine fear. Color drained from his cheeks, like someone had opened a valve and let it all flow out. He took a step backward, almost imperceptible, but Victoria noticed. Noticed the way his hand fell away from Sienna's back, the way his shoulders tensed with sudden wariness. I don't believe we've met, Preston said, and his voice was strained in a way Victoria had never heard before, like he was forcing words past an obstruction in his throat. The stranger smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made the temperature in the immediate area seem to drop several degrees. No, he agreed, we haven't. He didn't offer his name, didn't extend his free hand for a shake, just stood there with that slight, dangerous smile and his fingers wrapped around Victoria's. An awkward silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Victoria didn't fully understand. Sienna's confidence seemed to waver, her eyes darting between the stranger and Preston with growing uncertainty. The practiced superiority she'd worn like armor was developing cracks, and Victoria felt a savage satisfaction in watching it crumble. Well, Sienna said finally, her voice higher than before, not quite as controlled, we should let you get back to your evening. But before they could leave, before Victoria could escape back into the relative safety of anonymity, the stranger did something Victoria never could have anticipated. He turned to her, his free hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted the barely leashed power radiating from his body. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and Victoria froze, caught in the intensity of his gaze. The heat there made her forget for a moment that they were in a crowded ballroom, that hundreds of people were watching, that Preston and Sienna stood mere feet away. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and Victoria realized what he was asking, what he was offering, a way to show Preston and Sienna exactly how far she'd moved on. A theatrical display of everything they'd wanted her to feel small about. Victoria didn't think, didn't let herself consider consequences or complications, or the fact that she was about to kiss a complete stranger in front of half of Portland's elite. She just nodded, lost in that intense gaze, trusting in a way she hadn't trusted anyone since finding Preston and Sienna in her bed. The stranger pulled her into the center of the ballroom with confident steps leading her away from the column and shadows into the full glare of the chandelier light. Victoria could feel the weight of eyes turning toward them, conversations pausing, music seeming to fade into background noise. They stood directly in Preston and Sienna's sightline, impossible to miss, impossible to ignore. Then he kissed her. The world disappeared. His lips were warm against hers, firm but careful, asking rather than demanding. One hand remained tangled with hers, while the other slid into her hair, careful not to disturb the pins Riley had spent an hour arranging, cradling the back of her head like she was something precious, something worth protecting. The kiss was slow, deliberate, not the hungry, desperate kind of kiss that spoke of need and conquest, but something deeper, a claiming that had everything to do with the electricity sparking between them and nothing to do with the audience Victoria knew was watching. He tasted like whiskey in winter nights, and the way he held her made Victoria feel both utterly safe and completely exposed. She should have pulled away. Should have remembered this was just for show, just a performance to salvage her pride and put Preston and Sienna in their place. But instead, Victoria kissed him back. Her free hand found his chest, fingers curling into the expensive fabric of his jacket as she leaned into him. Let herself feel the solid strength of his body, the careful way he held her, the heat that seemed to radiate through his suit and warm her from the outside in. Time stretched and compressed, seconds becoming hours, becoming heartbeats. When he finally pulled back, Victoria was breathless, dizzy, her entire body humming, with an awareness she'd never experienced before. Not with Preston, not with anyone. This stranger had kissed her once and awakened something she hadn't known existed. The ballroom had gone quiet. Victoria became aware of it gradually, the way you notice the absence of sound after living near train tracks for years. The conversations that had stopped, the music that seemed distant and muted, the weight of hundreds of eyes fixed on them with varying degrees of shock and fascination and fear. The stranger's hand was still in her hair, his forehead resting lightly against hers, as they both remembered how to breathe like normal people, instead of two people who'd just set the air between them on fire. "That should do it," he murmured, his lips quirking in a small smile that transformed his severe features into something almost beautiful. Reality crashed back like a wave Victoria hadn't seen coming. She turned her head slightly and saw Preston standing frozen, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like terror. His hand was pressed against his stomach like he'd taken a physical blow. Sienna had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her perfectly manicured hand pressed against her throat. But they weren't looking at Victoria. They were looking at him, at the stranger who'd just kissed her in front of everyone, who stood with his arms still around her waist and his expression unreadable. And around them, Victoria heard the whisper starting. Names being passed from mouth to mouth, recognition spreading through the crowd like wildfire through dry grass. People were backing away, creating space around them, their expressions ranging from awe to fear to something that looked almost like reverence. "Do you know who that is?" someone hisses nearby, their voice carrying in the strange hush that had fallen over the ballroom. "The Alphaking?" Another voice answered, hushed and almost reverent. "That's Marcus Blackwood. He never comes to these events. Never." Alphaking. The words didn't make sense to Victoria, who stood there trying to process what was happening. Trying to understand why Preston looked like he might be sick. Why Sienna had taken several steps backward. Why the entire room seemed to have collectively decided to give them a wide berth. Marcus. So that was his name. Marcus Blackwood. The stranger who'd offered to be her ally, who'd kissed her like she was worth something, who apparently held enough power to make a room full of Portland's elites scatter like frightened children. "I should have introduced myself properly," Marcus said softly, his attention never leaving her face. "My apologies." Victoria pulled back slightly, looking up at him with new awareness. At the power she could practically feel vibrating through him now that she knew to look for it. At the barely restrained strength in the way he held her, careful not to crush, but impossible to break free from. At eyes that had seen things Victoria couldn't begin to imagine. "I didn't know," Victoria whispered, and somehow that felt important. That she hadn't known who he was when she'd taken his hand. That she'd trusted him as just a man, not as whatever this Alpha King title meant. "I know," Marcus said, and his smile was genuine this time, transforming his features from severe to something that stole Victoria's breath and all over again. That's what made it perfect. Before Victoria could respond, before she could demand answers or run away or do any of the sensible things she should have done, a new voice cut through the whispers and stares. "Your Majesty." An older woman had approached, moving with lethal fluidity that reminded Victoria of a hunting cat. She had copper-red hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and wore a burgundy dress that looked both elegant and somehow dangerous. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, taking in Victoria with the kind of scrutiny that made her want to straighten her spine and prove she belonged here. The woman bowed slightly, her eyes carefully avoiding Victoria's. "Forgive the interruption, but there's a situation that requires your attention." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His arm around Victoria's waist remained steady, but she felt the tension that ran through his body at the woman's words. "What kind of situation, Natasha?" "The kind best discussed in private, sir." Natasha's gaze flicked to Victoria for just a moment, her expression unreadable before returning to Marcus. For a long moment, Marcus didn't respond. His hand was still on Victoria's waist, his body angled protectively toward hers, and his expression suggested he didn't want to let her go. Didn't want to leave her standing alone in this ballroom, full of curious, frightened, judgmental eyes. But then he exhaled slowly and nodded. "Very well." He turned back to Victoria, and his voice dropped low enough that only she could hear. "Don't leave, please. I'll find you." Then he was gone, moving through the crowd with Natasha at his side. People parted before him like water around stone, their heads bowing slightly as he passed, their eyes tracking his movement, with the kind of wariness you'd give a wolf in sheep's clothing. A predator temporarily leashed, but never truly tame. Victoria stood alone beneath the chandelier, her lips still tingling from his kiss, her hand still warm from his touch, surrounded by whispers that grew louder now that Marcus had left. She caught fragments of conversations, speculation about why the Alpha King had kissed her, theories about who she was, warnings about what happened to humans who caught the attention of his kind. His kind. The words echoed in Victoria's mind, carrying implications she didn't fully understand but knew instinctively were important, life-changing, dangerous. And across the room, Preston watched her with an expression Victoria had never seen before on his face. Pure, absolute fear. Victoria's legs felt unsteady beneath her adrenaline and shock, making her movements wooden as she made her way toward the terrace doors. She needed air, needed space to think without the weight of all those stares and whispers pressing down on her like a physical force. The terrace was blessedly empty when she stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her face like a blessing after the suffocating atmosphere inside. Portland's lights stretched out below, a sea of illumination that should have been beautiful, but just made Victoria feel small and lost, and so far out of her depth that she couldn't see the surface anymore. What had she done? She'd kissed a stranger to get revenge on her ex-boyfriend, and somehow that simple act of petty vindication had turned into something much bigger, much more dangerous. Alpha King, his kind, the way everyone had looked at Marcus with fear and reverence in equal measure. Victoria gripped the stone railing with both hands, trying to slow her racing heart, trying to make sense of a night that had spiraled so far out of her control that she couldn't even see where it had gone wrong. "You look like you're considering jumping." Victoria spun around to find Natasha leaning against the terrace wall, her posture casual but her eyes sharp. Up close, she was even more striking, with features that were both beautiful and somehow predatory. Like she could smile at you while planning exactly how to take you apart if the situation called for it. "I'm not," Victoria said, though the thought had crossed her mind. Not seriously, but as one of those fleeting what-if scenarios that run through your head when the world stops making sense. Natasha smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Good, that would be a waste. And Marcus would probably level the building in response. He gets territorial. The casual mention of destruction made Victoria's pulse quicken. You work for him. I'm his beta, second in command essentially. I handle the things he's too important or too volatile to deal with directly. Natasha pushed off the wall, moving closer with that same hunter's economy of movement. Like overly curious humans who don't know when to stay away. The warning in her tone was unmistakable, but Victoria refused to back down. Maybe it was the champagne still in her system. Maybe it was 3 years of making herself smaller for Preston's comfort finally reaching a breaking point. Maybe it was just that after the night she'd had threats from beautiful strangers didn't seem particularly impressive anymore. I didn't ask for any of this, Victoria said quietly, meeting Natasha's sharp gaze without flinching. He offered to help. I accepted. That's all. Natasha studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then the predatory edge softened fractionally. No, I don't suppose you did ask for it. But that doesn't change what happened in there. You kissed the Alpha King in front of witnesses. In our world, that means something. What does it mean? Victoria asked, even though part of her didn't want to know. Didn't want to hear how a single impulsive decision had altered the trajectory of her entire life. Natasha was quiet, considering her words. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge. That depends on what Marcus decides. He's unpredictable on his best days, and tonight he's acting completely out of character. Do you have any idea why he would choose you? The question stung more than it should have. Because I was convenient, Victoria thought. Because he felt sorry for the pathetic human woman getting humiliated by her ex. Because I was there and desperate, and he saw an opportunity to do something kind in the middle of what was probably another boring evening. Does it matter? Victoria asked instead, her voice flat. It matters, Natasha said, and there was concern in her expression now. Because Marcus doesn't do anything without a reason. And he certainly doesn't kiss humans in front of his entire community without there being something else happening. She moved to stand beside Victoria at the railing, both of them looking out over the city lights. Tell me exactly what happened before the kiss. What did he say to you? Victoria recounted the conversation as best she could remember, though the details felt hazy now, overwhelmed by the memory of Marcus's lips on hers. The way he'd held her like she was both precious and powerful. The electricity that had sparked between them, turning what should have been a performance into something devastatingly real. An ally, Natasha murmured when Victoria finished. He offered to be your ally tonight. Is that significant? It's ancient terminology, Lycan terminology. Natasha turned to face Victoria fully, and for the first time there was genuine concern in her eyes. When a Lycan offers to be someone's ally, it's not casual. It's a pledge of protection. And for someone in Marcus's position to make that offer to a human he just met, she shook her head. Something else is happening here. Something I don't understand yet. Before Victoria could process that, the terrace doors opened again. Preston stepped through, his eyes locking onto Victoria with an intensity that made her step backward instinctively. Natasha moved between them with lethal fluidity, her posture shifting into something unmistakably threatening. I don't think that's a good idea, Natasha said, her voice dropping to something almost feral. Preston barely glanced at her, his attention fixed on Victoria. This doesn't concern you. Tori and I have history. We need to talk. Had? Victoria corrected, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. We had history, past tense. Don't be naive, Tori. Preston took a step forward, and there was the temper Victoria had learned to navigate so carefully during their relationship. The flash of irritation when things didn't go his way, when someone challenged his authority or made him feel less than in control. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Marcus Blackwood is dangerous. He's not human, Tori. He's a predator, and you just painted a target on your back. Interesting, Natasha said coolly, that you seem more concerned about her safety now than you were when you were sleeping with her best friend. Preston's face flushed red, anger and embarrassment warring for dominance. You know nothing about our relationship. I know enough. Natasha's voice had dropped to something that made the hair on the back of Victoria's neck stand up. And I know that if you don't leave this terrace in the next 10 seconds, I'll make you leave. Painfully. For a moment, Victoria thought Preston might argue. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw working as he struggled with whatever response he wanted to make. But then his expression shifted, fear winning out over anger, and he took a step back toward the doors. "This isn't over," Preston said, looking at Victoria with worry mixed with possessiveness. The kind that came from not wanting something yourself, but not wanting anyone else to have it either. When he loses interest, when he gets bored or finds someone more entertaining, you'll remember that I tried to warn you. Then he was gone, the doors closing behind him with a soft click that sounded final in the night air. Victoria released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her hands were shaking, she realized. Not from fear of Preston, but from the accumulated stress of the entire evening finally catching up with her. The betrayal, the confrontation, the kiss, the revelations. It was too much, too fast. Too overwhelming for someone who just wanted to show up at a charity gala and prove she could survive seeing her ex-boyfriend with her former best friend. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly. Natasha shook her head. "Don't thank me yet. He's right about one thing, even if his motivations are selfish. Marcus is dangerous. Not in the way your ex-boyfriend thinks, but dangerous nonetheless." She turned to face Victoria, fully, her expression grave. "He's powerful, ancient, and bound by laws and customs you don't understand. And right now, whether you intended it or not, you're caught in the middle of something much bigger than a revenge kiss at a society gala." "What do I do?" The question came out smaller than Victoria intended, more vulnerable. But she was tired of pretending to be strong when she felt like she was falling apart. Natasha studied her for a long moment, her expression shifting to something close to understanding. "You wait. Marcus will find you when he's done dealing with whatever crisis just came up, and then you'll have to make a choice." "What kind of choice?" "Whether to walk away and pretend tonight never happened." Natasha paused, her sharp eyes holding Victoria's. "Or step into a world that will never let you go once you cross the threshold. Choose carefully, Victoria, because once you're part of our world, there's no going back." She left Victoria alone on the terrace, then disappearing back into the gala with that same dangerous elegance. Victoria stood in the darkness, Portland's lights blurring, as tears finally escaped, tracking down her cheeks in hot trails she didn't bother to wipe away. She'd come to this gala hoping to prove something to Preston, to show him she was fine without him, that she'd moved on, that his betrayal hadn't broken her. Instead, she'd stumbled into something she didn't understand, kissed a king she'd never met, and apparently triggered consequences she couldn't begin to fathom. The sound of footsteps made Victoria turn, her heart jumping into her throat. Marcus stood in the terrace doorway, his jacket gone now, his white shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his expression carried worry beneath the careful control. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and rough. The situation was more complicated than Natasha initially thought. It took longer to resolve than I expected. Victoria wiped at her cheeks quickly, trying to hide the evidence of tears, trying to pull together some semblance of dignity. "It's fine. I should probably go anyway. This was—" She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "This was a mistake." "Don't." Marcus moved closer, each step deliberate and careful, as if Victoria were something wild that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Please don't go. Not yet." Why? The question came out sharper than Victoria intended, 3 years of suppressed frustration and pain finally finding a target. "Why did you kiss me? Why offer to help a complete stranger? What do you want from me?" Marcus stopped a few feet away, his gaze searching Victoria's face in the dim light filtering through from the ballroom. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she hadn't expected from someone who commanded such obvious power. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure." The admission surprised Victoria. She'd expected smooth lies or political maneuvering, not raw honesty that made him seem almost human despite whatever he actually was. "I saw you standing there." Marcus continued, struggling with the words, looking lost and hurt and so very alone in a room full of people. "And something in me," he paused, "something in me recognized that loneliness. I know what it's like to stand in a crowded room and feel invisible. To have people look at you and only see what they expect to see, never who you actually are." His words struck something deep inside Victoria. A resonance she couldn't deny even though she barely knew this man, this creature, this alpha king who turned her entire world upside down with a single kiss. "So, you kissed me out of solidarity?" Victoria asked, trying to keep her tone light even as her heart pounded. "Lonely people unite. I kissed you because when I looked into your eyes, I saw courage." Marcus took another step closer, close enough now that Victoria could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You were falling apart inside, but you were still standing, still fighting, still refusing to let them break you." He reached out slowly, giving Victoria plenty of time to pull away and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers were gentle, reverent, almost completely at odds with the power she could feel coiled beneath his skin. "And because I wanted to," Marcus said softly, "more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." The honesty in his voice made Victoria's breath catch. This was the Alpha King, a being of immense power and influence that made Portland's elite scatter like frightened sheep. And he was standing before her looking almost vulnerable, almost human, almost within reach. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could form words, Marcus's phone buzzed. He pulled it out with obvious reluctance, his expression darkening as he read whatever message had just come through. "What is it?" Victoria asked, even though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Marcus looked up at her, and the vulnerability was gone, replaced by something harder. Something that reminded Victoria exactly how dangerous Natasha had said he was. "There's been a development," he said carefully. "The photos from tonight. Someone leaked them to the supernatural networks. They're everywhere now. Social media news sites, private channels, and some of my people aren't happy about it." Ice flooded Victoria's veins. "What does that mean?" Marcus's hand came up to cup her face, his touch achingly gentle despite the tension radiating through his body. "It means you're in danger, real danger. There are factions within the Lycan community who view humans as lesser. The fact that I publicly showed interest in you has stirred up old prejudices, old hatreds." "How much danger?" Victoria asked, though she could read the answer in his expression. "Enough that I need to get you somewhere safe, now, tonight." His thumb stroked across her cheekbone, and Victoria saw fear flash through his gaze, not for himself but for her. "I'm sorry, I never meant to put you in this position. If I'd known this would escalate so quickly—" "It's not your fault," Victoria interrupted, even though terror was creeping up her spine like frost. "I made the choice to kiss you back. I'm responsible for my own decisions." Expression shifted across Marcus's features. Respect, maybe? Or surprise that she wasn't running screaming into the night. "Come with me, please. Let me keep you safe while we figure this out. I have an estate outside the city. It's secure, protected. No one will touch you there." Victoria should have said no, should have recognized this for the trap it was accepting, protection from a powerful stranger who'd already turned her life into chaos. But the alternative was going home to her apartment, where Preston knew the address, where whoever these angry Lycans were could find her easily, where she'd be alone and vulnerable and utterly out of her depth. And beneath the fear, beneath the rational voice screaming at her to run, Victoria felt something else. That same electric connection she'd felt when Marcus kissed her. The sense that this man, this creature, this king saw her in a way no one else ever had. Saw past the borrowed dress and the broken heart, and the fear to whatever was underneath. Whatever Victoria herself had forgotten how to see. "Okay," she heard herself say, "I'll come with you." Marcus's eyes closed briefly, relief washing over his features. When he opened them again, the intensity there stole Victoria's breath. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me. I won't let anything happen to you. That's a promise." He took her hand, his fingers threading through hers with that same careful strength. "Natasha will bring your things from your apartment. You won't need to go back there tonight. Right now, we need to leave before anyone else decides to make a move." As Marcus led her back through the ballroom, Victoria caught sight of Preston one last time. He stood near the bar, watching her leave with Marcus, his face pale and his expression caught somewhere between fear and something that might have been regret. Too little, too late. Sienna was nowhere to be seen. The other guests parted before them like they had before giving Marcus and Victoria a wide berth. But their eyes tracked the movement, hungry for gossip, for scandal. for whatever story they'd tell tomorrow about the night the Alpha King kissed an unknown human woman, and everything changed. Victoria walked through the massive doors of the Grand Cascade Hotel with her hand in Marcus Blackwood's, leaving behind the life she'd known and stepping into something she couldn't begin to understand. All because she'd kissed a stranger to forget her pain and found something that might destroy her entirely. Part 2. Trial by Blood. The estate emerged from the forest like something conjured from a Gothic fairy tale. Victoria pressed her face against the car window, watching as towering pine trees gave way to manicured grounds and stone walls that looked ancient enough to have witnessed centuries. The main house rose before them, all dark wood and riverstone with massive windows that reflected the moonlight like watchful eyes. Turrets stretched toward the sky at each corner, and ivy climbed the walls in patterns that seemed both deliberate and wild. They'd been driving for nearly 2 hours, winding up into the Cascade Mountains, on roads that grew progressively narrower and more isolated. Natasha had been silent behind the wheel, her copper hair pulled back into a severe ponytail, her eyes constantly checking the mirrors as if expecting pursuit. Marcus sat beside Victoria in the back seat, his hand never leaving hers, his thumb tracing absent patterns across her knuckles that should have been soothing, but only reminded her how far she was from anything familiar. The gates had opened automatically as they approached heavy iron worked into designs that looked like wolves mid-leap. Guards flanked the entrance, both dressed in dark suits that did nothing to hide the dangerous elegance in their movements. They watched the car pass with eyes that caught the light, wrong reflecting amber instead of the normal colors Victoria expected. Neither man smiled or acknowledged them. They simply stood there perfectly still, radiating the kind of threat that made Victoria's lizard brain scream danger even as her rational mind tried to process what she was seeing. "Welcome to Thornridge Estate," Marcus said quietly as the car pulled to a stop before the main entrance. "This has been my family's home for nearly 200 years. 200 years. The number rattled around in Victoria's head, not quite fitting with her understanding of how the world worked. How old was Marcus? How long did his kind live? What exactly was his kind? The questions piled up behind her teeth, but exhaustion and shock kept them trapped there unspoken. The front doors opened before they reached them, revealing an interior that managed to be both imposing and oddly welcoming. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, but it was offset by soft lighting from wrought iron fixtures that looked handcrafted. Artwork decorated the halls, some pieces clearly modern, others that looked old enough to belong in museums. Persian rugs covered hardwood floors polished to a mirror shine, and a grand staircase swept upward to the second floor in an elegant curve. "Miss Bennett's suite is ready in the east wing," a man said, appearing from somewhere deeper in the house. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair, and the kind of formal bearing that suggested he had spent his life in service to powerful people. His eyes, when they landed on Victoria, were kind, despite the obvious assessment happening behind them. "Thank you, Harrison," Marcus said, his hand moving to the small of Victoria's back. The touch was light, barely there, but Victoria felt it like a brand through the fabric of her borrowed gown. "Miss Bennett will be staying with us indefinitely. Please ensure she has everything she needs." Indefinitely. The word echoed in Victoria's mind as Harrison led them through a maze of corridors, up the sweeping staircase, and down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women who all seemed to share Marcus's intense gaze and sharp features. Ancestors, Victoria realized. Generations of whatever Marcus was stretching back through those 2 centuries he'd mentioned. The suite Harrison showed her to was more spacious than Victoria's entire apartment. A sitting room decorated in soft grays and creams opened onto a bedroom with a 4-poster bed that looked like it could sleep 4 people comfortably. French doors led to a private balcony overlooking gardens that stretched into darkness, and an ensuite bathroom featured a clawfoot tub large enough to swim in. "Your belongings should arrive within the hour," Harrison said, his tone professional but not unkind. "If you need anything before then, there's an intercom system by the bed. Simply press the button and someone will assist you." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded far too final for Victoria's comfort. She stood in the center of the sitting room, still wearing the borrowed gown and pinching heels, and tried to process how her life had become unrecognizable in the span of a few hours. This morning she'd been Victoria Bennett, marketing coordinator, living her quiet life in Portland, nursing a broken heart and trying to figure out how to move forward after betrayal. Tonight she was standing in a Gothic estate in the mountains under the protection of a man who called himself an Alpha King, apparently in danger from factions she didn't understand for the crime of kissing the wrong person at a charity gala. The absurdity of it should have been funny. Instead, Victoria felt tears burning behind her eyes again, exhaustion and fear, and delayed shock finally catching up with her. She sank onto the plush couch, kicked off the torturous heels, and let herself cry. Not the pretty, delicate crying from romance novels, but the ugly, gasping kind that came from somewhere deep in her chest. The kind that hurt coming out, but felt necessary like lancing an infected wound. She didn't hear the door open. Didn't realize she wasn't alone anymore until Marcus's voice, soft and rough, said her name like a question. "I'm fine," Victoria said automatically, not looking up, not wanting him to see her like this. Broken down and falling apart when she'd been trying so hard to appear strong. "No," Marcus said, and there was that gentle contradiction again. "You're not." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the couch, close, but not touching, giving her space while making his presence known. Victoria could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell something that reminded her of pine forests and winter nights. Something wild and clean that had nothing to do with cologne or artifice. "I'm sorry," Marcus said after a long moment of silence, broken only by Victoria's attempts to get her breathing under control. "I should have been more careful, should have anticipated the consequences. I put you in danger because I was selfish." "Selfish?" Victoria finally looked at him, saw the tension in his shoulders, the genuine distress in his gaze. "You helped me. You didn't have to do that." "I helped myself," Marcus corrected. "I saw someone beautiful and brave and hurting, and I wanted to be close to that. Wanted to feel less alone for a few minutes. I didn't think about what it would cost you." Beautiful. The words settled over Victoria like a blanket she wasn't sure she deserved. Preston had called her pretty sometimes in the absent way you compliment someone's new haircut or choice of restaurant. But beautiful said with that rough sincerity in Marcus's voice felt different, felt real in a way that made her chest ache. "What exactly is happening?" Victoria asked, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. What does Alpha King mean? Why do people look at you like they're not sure whether to bow or run?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression distant, as if he was trying to figure out where to start explaining a world Victoria didn't know existed. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely between them. "My people are lichens," he said. "Werewolves in the human mythology, though that term doesn't capture what we actually are. We're not cursed or infected. We're born this way. A separate species that's existed alongside humanity for thousands of years, hidden in plain sight. Werewolves. The word should have sounded ridiculous. Should have made Victoria laugh and accuse Marcus of playing an elaborate prank. But she thought about the guards with their amber eyes, about the way people had backed away from Marcus in the ballroom, about Natasha's dangerous elegance, and the casual way she'd threatened Preston. And somehow, impossibly, it made a terrible kind of sense. "The Alpha King is the leader of all lichen packs in North America," Marcus continued. "I inherited the title when my parents were killed 19 years ago. I was 19, barely more than a child, and suddenly responsible for maintaining peace between dozens of territorial packs, negotiating with other supernatural communities, and keeping our existence secret from the human world." He ran a hand through his hair, and Victoria saw exhaustion in the gesture. The weight of nearly 2 decades spent carrying a responsibility he'd never asked for. "There are factions within our community who believe in purity. Pure lichen bloodlines, no mixing with humans, no relationships that might dilute what they see as our strength and superiority. When I kissed you publicly, I sent a message that I was open to a human partnership. And some of my people view that as betrayal." "How many people want me dead?" Victoria asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Not dead necessarily," Marcus said, though his expression suggested that was a generous interpretation. "Removed from the equation, there are 3 packs who formally requested permission to eliminate what they're calling a corrupting influence. I denied those requests, obviously. But Counselor Garrett Stone, who leads the Purist faction, is influential. He can make things very difficult." Victoria processed this information, trying to fit it into her understanding of reality. Failing. "And the kiss, you said it means something in your culture. What exactly, Tom?" A public kiss between lichens, especially one initiated by a male of high status, is considered acclaiming, Marcus said carefully. The first stage of a mate bond. It's a declaration of serious interest and intent. The fact that I did it in front of witnesses makes it official, binding in a way that can't be easily dismissed. Mate bond. The term sent a shiver down Victoria's spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the electric connection she'd felt when Marcus kissed her. The sense that something fundamental had shifted in that moment, something she couldn't explain or rationalize away. But I'm human, Victoria said. Doesn't that make it impossible? Not impossible. Difficult, complicated, controversial. Marcus finally turned to look at her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made Victoria's breath catch. But not impossible. The bond doesn't care about species. It cares about connection, recognition, the sense that you've found someone who sees you completely and chooses you anyway. Is that what you felt? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When you kissed me, Marcus held her gaze and vulnerability passed across his features. Raw emotion that she suspected he rarely allowed anyone to see. Yes, he said simply. I felt it. The beginning of something I didn't expect and wasn't looking for, but can't deny now that it started. Before Victoria could respond, before she could process what that admission meant, there was a knock at the door. Natasha entered without waiting for permission, carrying several bags that Victoria recognized as belonging to her. Your roommate was very helpful, Natasha said, setting the bags down near the bedroom door, also very worried and slightly terrified. I assured her you were safe and would contact her tomorrow. She glanced between Marcus and Victoria, her sharp eyes taking in the intimate distance between them on the couch, the tear tracks on Victoria's face, the tension humming in the air. The council has requested an emergency session for tomorrow morning. They want to address the situation formally. Marcus's jaw tightened. Tell them I'll attend, alone. They specifically requested Miss Bennett's presence. Natasha said, her tone carefully neutral. They want to meet the human who's caused such disruption. Absolutely not, Marcus said, his voice dropping to something that made the hair on Victoria's arms stand up. She's not ready for that. She's not. I'll go, Victoria interrupted, surprised by her own certainty. Both Marcus and Natasha turned to look at her, matching expressions of surprise on their faces. If this council wants to meet me, then I should face them. I'm not a child to be hidden away while adults discuss my fate. Victoria, Marcus said, his tone gentle but firm. You don't understand what you're agreeing to. The council can be brutal. They'll question everything about you, looking for weakness, for reasons to dismiss you as unsuitable. They'll try to break you down. Let them try, Victoria said, and there was steel in her voice that surprised even her. 3 years of making herself smaller for Preston, of swallowing her opinions and adjusting her personality to fit his expectations, had left her with a reservoir of suppressed strength she'd forgotten existed. I'm tired of other people making decisions about my life. If I'm in danger because of that kiss, then I deserve to face the people threatening me. I deserve to defend myself. Natasha's lips quirked in what might have been approval. She's braver than you gave her credit for, Marcus. I know exactly how brave she is, Marcus said quietly, his attention never leaving Victoria's face. That's what terrifies me. The three of them discussed logistics for another 30 minutes. The council would convene at 10 in the morning, which gave Victoria less than 8 hours to sleep, process everything she'd learned, and prepare to face judgment from creatures she'd thought were mythology until tonight. Natasha promised to return at dawn to begin what she called political education, teaching Victoria the basics of lichen customs and hierarchy, so she wouldn't accidentally insult anyone or make things worse. After Natasha left, Marcus lingered at the door, clearly reluctant to leave Victoria alone. Get some rest, he said softly. Tomorrow will be difficult, but I'll be there. I won't let them hurt you. I'm not fragile, Victoria said, needing him to understand that, needing someone to see her as something other than a victim or a problem to be solved. I'm scared. I'm way out of my depth, but I'm not fragile. I survived Preston's betrayal. I'll survive this too. Expression shifted across Marcus's features, respect mixing with what looked like wonder. No, he agreed. You're not fragile. You're steel wrapped in silk. I'm only now beginning to understand that. He left her then, and Victoria changed into her own clothes, soft pajamas that Riley had packed along with toiletries, in a note that read simply, "Call me when you can. I'm freaking out, but also kind of impressed. You kissed a werewolf king, WTF, Tori." Victoria smiled, despite everything, grateful for Riley's ability to find humor even in impossible situations. She texted back a quick message, "Safe. We'll explain everything tomorrow. Also, I'm freaking out too." Then she turned off her phone and crawled into the massive bed, certain she wouldn't be able to sleep. She was wrong. Exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, pulling her under into dreams of intense gazes and dangerous smiles and the taste of whiskey and winter. Victoria woke to sunlight streaming through the French doors and the smell of coffee. She sat up groggily, her body protesting the evening's emotional toll, and found a tray on the bedside table with fresh coffee, fruit, and pastries that smelled like heaven. A note in elegant handwriting read, "Good morning, Natasha will be up at 8. Take your time. M." The clock showed 7:30, which gave Victoria just enough time to shower, dress in jeans and a simple blouse from her hastily packed bags, and drink enough coffee to feel almost human. She was finishing the last pastry when Natasha knocked and entered, carrying what looked like a textbook and a tablet. "Morning," Natasha said, settling into one of the sitting room chairs with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. "We have 2 hours before the council session. I'm going to try to teach you everything you need to know about Lycan society. Try to keep up." The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of information that made Victoria's head spin. Natasha explained the pack structure, the hierarchy that placed the Alpha King at the top with 12 regional counselors beneath him, each representing a major territory. She outlined the complicated customs around challenges, territory rights, and the laws that governed interactions between Lycans and humans. "The most important thing to understand," Natasha said, her tone serious, "is that strength is respected above everything else. Not just physical strength, though that matters. Mental fortitude, the ability to stand your ground under pressure. If you show weakness, if you back down, or apologize for existing, they'll view you as unworthy of Marcus's attention." "What about the mate bond?" Victoria asked, trying to focus despite the overwhelming amount of information being thrown at her. "How does that work?" Natasha's expression softened slightly. "The mate bond is sacred in our culture. When two Lycans recognize each other as potential mates, it creates a connection that grows stronger over time. The public kiss Marcus gave you initiated the first stage. If both parties choose to complete the bond, it requires a formal ceremony and for a human transformation." Victoria's stomach dropped. Transformation. "The mate bond can't fully form between a human and a Lycan," Natasha explained. "The human partner would need to be turned bitten during the full moon ceremony and transformed into a Lycan themselves. It's not without risks. The transformation has a 40% failure rate for adults. Some people's bodies reject the change. They die instead of completing the transformation." 40%, the number hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Victoria could die trying to complete this bond that Marcus said he felt forming between them. Could die because she'd kissed a stranger to get revenge on her ex-boyfriend. "But that's getting ahead of ourselves." Natasha continued, her tone becoming brisk again. "First, you need to survive the council. They're going to question everything. Your background, your motivations, your fitness to stand beside an Alpha King. Your job is to answer honestly but strategically. Don't volunteer information they don't ask for. Don't apologize for being human. And for the love of all that's holy, don't cry." Victoria bristled at that last instruction. "I'm not planning to cry." "Good, because tears are seen as manipulation in our culture. Weakness trying to disguise itself as vulnerability." Natasha stood smoothing her burgundy suit. "It's almost time. Marcus is waiting downstairs to take you to the council chamber." Victoria followed Natasha through the estate's winding corridors, her heart pounding harder with each step. They descended the grand staircase to find Marcus waiting in the foyer, dressed in a charcoal suit that made him look every inch the king. His gaze found Victoria immediately, and she saw concern there mixed with something that might have been pride. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said quietly as Victoria reached him. "I can handle the council. Keep you out of it." "No," Victoria said firmly. "I face them." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. He offered his arm, a formal gesture that felt significant in ways Victoria didn't fully understand. She took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the expensive fabric, and let him guide her toward wherever this council chamber was. They drove for 20 minutes through winding mountain roads before reaching a building that looked like it had been carved from the mountainside itself. Stone and glass blended seamlessly with the natural rock formations, creating something that was both modern and ancient. More guards flanked the entrance, their amber eyes tracking Victoria with expressions that ranged from curious to hostile. The council chamber was circular with walls made almost entirely of glass that offered views of the forest beyond. 12 chairs were arranged in a semicircle, each occupied by someone who radiated the same power Victoria had sensed in Marcus and Natasha. They turned as one when the doors opened, their eyes fixing on Victoria with an intensity that made her want to step backward. But she didn't. She kept her spine straight and her chin up, walking into the center of the room where a raised platform indicated she was meant to stand. Marcus moved to a throne-like chair elevated above the others, his face settling into an expression of absolute authority that Victoria had never seen before. "Let us begin," said an older man with silver hair and cold eyes. He sat directly opposite Marcus, and Victoria recognized the contempt in his expression immediately. This, she realized, must be Counselor Garrett Stone, the man who led the faction that wanted her eliminated. Stone's gaze swept over Victoria with barely disguised disdain. "Victoria Bennett," he said, her name sounding like an insult in his mouth. "You've caused quite a disruption in our community. A human woman kissing the Alpha King in front of witnesses, forcing us to address questions we thought settled decades ago." "I didn't force anything," Victoria said, proud that her voice came out steady. "Marcus offered help. I accepted. Everything that followed was a natural consequence of that choice." "Natural," Stone repeated, his tone mocking. "There's nothing natural about a human claiming the attention of our king. You're weak, fragile, unsuitable for someone of his status and power. You'll age and wither while he remains young. You'll die in transformation or live a fraction of the years he will. You're a liability waiting to happen." The words were designed to cut, to make Victoria feel small and inadequate, and they worked, each one landing like a carefully aimed blade. But Victoria thought about the past 3 years with Preston, about all the times she'd made herself smaller to accommodate his ego, and something in her rebelled. "You're right," Victoria said, and saw a surprise flicker across Stone's face. "I am human. I am fragile compared to lichens. I will age while Marcus doesn't. Those are facts, not insults." She paused, meeting Stone's cold eyes directly. "But you know what else I am. I'm brave enough to stand here and face 12 predators who could kill me without effort. I'm strong enough to survive betrayal and keep standing. I'm smart enough to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate me through fear." She turned slowly, addressing the entire council rather than just Stone. "Marcus didn't choose me because I'm lichen or because I'm perfect. He chose me because I see him, not the crown or the power or the political position. The man who reads poetry late at night and misses his parents. The person underneath all the authority and responsibility." "Pretty words," Stone said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But words are cheap. What happens when the reality of our world crashes into your human sensibilities? When you're faced with violence and territory disputes and the harsh truths of what we are?" "Then I'll adapt," Victoria said simply. "Or I won't, but that's my choice to make, not yours." A woman with steel gray hair and sharp features leaned forward, her expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "Counselor Cordelia Frost," she introduced herself. "I have a question, Miss Bennett. What do you know about the mate bond?" "I know it's the first stage," Victoria said, drawing on everything Natasha had taught her that morning. "I know completing it would require transformation, which has a 40% failure rate. I know I could die trying to be with Marcus, and I know that terrifies me." "Yet you're still here," Frost observed. "Yes," Victoria agreed, "because fear isn't a good enough reason to walk away from something that matters." "Does it matter?" another counselor asked, a younger man with kind eyes. "You've known Marcus for less than a day. How can you claim this connection is real?" Victoria thought about that kiss in the ballroom, about the way electricity had sparked between them, about the recognition she'd felt when their eyes met, about Marcus standing beside her on the terrace, his voice rough with vulnerability as he admitted his own loneliness. "I don't know if it's real. Victoria admitted. It's too soon to know that, but I know it's worth finding out. I know that in the worst moment of my life, Marcus saw me, really saw me, not as a victim or a problem or someone to be fixed, as someone with strength and courage even when I couldn't see those things in myself. She paused, feeling exposed but refusing to look away. That's rare, that's precious, and I think it's worth fighting for. The chamber fell silent. Victoria could feel Marcus's attention on her, could sense the tension radiating from him, even though he hadn't moved or spoken. Stone's face had gone red with barely suppressed fury, while Frost looked almost thoughtful. The council will deliberate, Frost announced, standing with measured grace. Alphaking Miss Bennett, please wait in the antechamber while we discuss our recommendation. Marcus descended from his elevated chair and crossed to Victoria, offering his hand. She took it, grateful for the solid warmth of his touch, and let him guide her from the council chamber into a smaller room furnished with comfortable chairs and windows overlooking the forest. The moment the door closed, Victoria's legs gave out. Marcus caught her, lowering them both to one of the couches, his arms solid and reassuring around her. You were magnificent, he murmured against her hair, and Victoria could hear the rough emotion in his voice. Brave and strong and absolutely magnificent. I was terrified, Victoria admitted, her face pressed against his chest, listening to the steady thunder of his heartbeat. That made it more impressive, Marcus said. He pulled back enough to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away tears Victoria hadn't realized were falling. You stood there and faced them all. Didn't back down, didn't apologize for existing. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Before Victoria could respond, the door opened. Natasha stood there, her expression grave. They're ready. Victoria and Marcus returned to the council chamber, both of them bracing for whatever verdict awaited. The 12 counselors stood as they entered, their faces somber. Frost stepped forward as spokesperson, her steel gray hair catching the light filtering through the glass walls. We have deliberated, Frost said formally, and while there are significant concerns about the unprecedented nature of this situation, we cannot deny that Miss Bennett has demonstrated qualities worthy of respect, courage, intelligence, and a strength of character that many Lycans would struggle to match. Victoria's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She felt Marcus's hand tighten on hers, felt the tension running through his body like a current. However, Stone interrupted, his voice sharp with barely controlled anger. Respect is not the same as acceptance. Miss Bennett has proven she's braver than expected. But bravery alone doesn't make her suitable to stand beside our king. She's still human, still mortal, still a fundamental weakness in our leadership. What are you suggesting, Counselor Stone? Marcus's voice was deadly quiet, more frightening than any shout. A compromise, Stone said, and Victoria saw the trap closing before he even finished speaking. Miss Bennett wishes to prove herself worthy, then let her do so through action, not words. The Northern Montana Territory dispute has been escalating for months. Previous mediators have failed. Some have died. If Miss Bennett can resolve this crisis alone, without your protection or interference, then we will accept her presence in your life. We will grant her full citizenship and recognition. And if she fails, Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, then she leaves, Stone said simply, permanently. The mate bond dissolves and we never speak of this disruption again. The chamber erupted into argument. Several counselors objected to the terms as too harsh, too dangerous. Others supported Stone's proposal as fair as giving Victoria the chance to prove herself she claimed to want. Through it all, Victoria stood silent, her mind racing. This was a trap. Stone was sending her into a situation designed to kill her, or at least guarantee her failure. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to prove that she was more than a liability, more than a weak human who'd caught the Alpha King's temporary attention. I accept, Victoria said, her voice cutting through the chaos. Every eye in the chamber turned to her. Marcus looked stricken, his face pale beneath his natural tan. Victoria, no, you don't understand what you're agreeing to. The Montana situation is volatile, dangerous. I understand perfectly, Victoria interrupted, meeting his gaze steadily. I understand that I'll never be accepted here if I hide behind your protection. I understand that Stone is trying to get rid of me by sending me into a situation designed to break me. And I understand that the only way forward is through. She turned to face the council, to face Stone's satisfied smirk and Frost's worried expression. 90 days, Victoria said firmly. Give me 90 days to resolve the Montana crisis. If I fail, I leave and you never see me again. But if I succeed, you grant me full citizenship and accept my relationship with Marcus without further interference. No more challenges, no more tests. Those are my terms. Stone's eyes gleamed with triumph. Agreed. Frost opened her mouth as if to object, but then closed it again, nodding slowly. The council accepts these terms. Victoria Bennett, you have 90 days to prove your worth. May fortune favor the brave. The session ended in controlled chaos, counselors arguing amongst themselves as they filed out. Marcus stood frozen, his hands still clasped with Victoria's, his expression caught between fury and devastation. You shouldn't have agreed, he said quietly once they were alone. I could have fought this, could have invoked my authority to override their decision. And then what? Victoria asked gently. Spend the rest of our lives with them, resenting me, undermining you, waiting for the first chance to challenge your authority. This way I prove myself. I earn their respect instead of just demanding it. You could die, Marcus said, and his voice broke on the last word. The Montana situation is a powder keg. Lycans and humans on the brink of war, both sides armed and angry. Previous mediators have been caught in the crossfire. You're not trained for this, Victoria. You are not ready. Then we have 3 weeks to make me ready, Victoria said with more confidence than she felt. Teach me, train me, give me everything I need to survive this and win. Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly Victoria could barely breathe. But she didn't complain. She just wrapped her arms around him and held on both of them, standing in the council chamber as afternoon sunlight filtered through the glass walls, and the weight of what Victoria had just agreed to settled over them like a shroud. 3 weeks. That's all she'd have at the estate before she'd need to leave for Montana. 3 weeks to learn everything she could about Lycan culture, about negotiation and survival, about the territory dispute she'd just volunteered to resolve. 3 weeks with Marcus before she walked into a situation that might kill her. Victoria thought about Preston's betrayal, about how devastated she'd been just yesterday, about standing in that ballroom feeling invisible and broken. And she thought about Marcus's kiss, about the way he'd seen straight through her pain to the strength underneath, about the electric connection between them that defied logic and reason. 3 weeks to prove she was worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth the risk. Victoria lifted her face from Marcus's chest and looked up at him, at the fear and pride and desperate protectiveness in his gaze. Teach me to survive, she said quietly, and then trust me to do it. Marcus's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with achingly gentle precision. I'm going to lose you, he said, and it sounded like a prophecy. I just found you, and I'm going to lose you. No, Victoria said firmly. You're going to teach me to fight, and then you're going to watch me win. She hoped she sounded more certain than she felt, hoped that the terror churning in her stomach didn't show on her face, because she'd just volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission, and the only thing standing between her and failure was her own stubborn refusal to back down. The borrowed dress from last night seemed like it belonged to a different lifetime. A different Victoria who'd thought her biggest problem was facing her ex-boyfriend at a charity gala. That Victoria was gone, burned away in the span of 24 hours. And in her place stood someone who'd just bet her life on her ability to resolve a crisis between two groups who wanted each other dead. Victoria looked at Marcus and saw her own fear reflected in his expression. But she also saw something else. Hope. The fragile, desperate kind that people clung to when everything else had been stripped away. 3 weeks, Victoria said. Make them count, Sita. Part 3, Queen's Ascension. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, pine trees so thick they blocked out portions of the Squantum. Victoria stood at the edge of a clearing, her breath misting in the cold mountain air, and tried not to think about how far she was from anything resembling safety. The small cabin behind her was supposed to be neutral territory, a place where both sides of this conflict had agreed to meet. But the broken windows and bullet holes in the wooden siding suggested that neutrality was a concept neither side particularly respected anymore. 3 weeks of training at Thornridge Estate had transformed Victoria in ways she was still processing. Natasha had been relentless, teaching her hand-to-hand combat weapons handling and the kind of tactical thinking that turned physical limitations into strategic advantages. Marcus had educated her on like-impact dynamics, territorial law, and the delicate art of negotiation when everyone involved could kill you without breaking a sweat. But nothing had fully prepared her for the reality of standing alone in disputed territory with two armed groups who'd spent months working themselves up to violence. The drive to Montana had taken 12 hours, Victoria sitting in silence while her two assigned guards, both young Lycans, named David and Michael, alternated driving shifts and tried not to look like they were escorting her to her execution. They'd been professional, respectful even, but Victoria had seen the doubt in their eyes. The certainty that she was walking into a situation she couldn't survive, let alone resolve. Marcus had wanted to come, had argued for hours that sending Victoria alone violated every instinct he possessed, that his presence would at least guarantee her physical safety. But that was precisely the point Stone had made when setting this challenge. Victoria needed to prove she could operate independently, that she wasn't just an extension of Marcus's power, but someone with value of her own. So Marcus had stayed behind, and Victoria had driven away from Thornridge with his final words echoing in her mind. "Come back to me," he'd said, his hands framing her face, his gaze holding hers with desperate intensity. "I don't care about the council's judgment or Stone's satisfaction. Just come back to me alive." Victoria had kissed him, then pouring 3 weeks of accumulated emotion into it. 3 weeks of early morning training sessions and late-night conversations in his library. 3 weeks of learning to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his shoulders tensed when he was worried, the soft tone his voice took when he let his guard down. 3 weeks of falling deeper into something that terrified her as much as it felt inevitable. "I'll come back," Victoria had promised, hoping she wasn't lying. Now standing in this clearing with afternoon shadows lengthening across the ground, Victoria reviewed what she knew about the situation. The conflict centered on a tract of forest that both the Silvertooth Lichen Pack and a local logging company claimed rights to. The Lycans had territorial deeds going back 100 years, but the logging company had recent permits from the state government. Both sides were convinced the other was trying to steal what rightfully belonged to them, and months of escalating tensions had brought them to the brink of open warfare. Previous mediators had tried to negotiate compromises, but those efforts had failed spectacularly. One mediator had been run out of town by the human militia leader, Colonel Hayes, who'd made his hatred of supernatural creatures very clear. Another had been found beaten nearly to death after meeting with representatives from the Silvertooth Pack, though no one would admit who was responsible. The third mediator had simply disappeared, and neither side seemed inclined to explain what had happened to him. Victoria's two guards had set up a perimeter around the cabin, but they'd made it clear they wouldn't interfere with the actual negotiations. This was Victoria's test, her chance to prove she could handle complex supernatural politics without hiding behind lichen protection. The thought should have been empowering. Instead, it just made Victoria feel isolated and frighteningly vulnerable. The sound of approaching vehicles made Victoria turn. Two trucks rumbled into the clearing from opposite directions, kicking up dust and fallen pine needles. From the north came a battered pickup that had seen better decades, 3 men climbing out with rifles slung over their shoulders. Colonel Hayes was immediately identifiable, a weathered man in his early 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen combat. The 2 men flanking him were younger, harder, with the kind of military bearing that never quite faded. From the south came a newer truck, this one carrying 2 Lycans, who moved with that lethal fluidity Victoria had learned to recognize. The older male had to be Magnus Ashwood, the Silvertooth Pack's leader. He was perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of presence that suggested he'd held authority for decades. The younger Lycan beside him was female, maybe 30, with calculating eyes that tracked Victoria's every movement. Victoria stood her ground as both groups approached, neither side acknowledging the other's presence. This was already a bad sign. Successful negotiation required at least minimal communication between parties, and these two groups were treating each other like they didn't exist. "Miss Bennett," Colonel Hayes said, his voice carrying the flat tones of someone who'd spent years issuing commands and expecting obedience. "I'm told you're here to resolve our little dispute, though I will be honest, I don't see how some city girl with no military experience thinks she can accomplish what trained negotiators couldn't. Maybe that's exactly why I can help. Victoria said evenly, refusing to be baited by the dismissal in his tone. Previous negotiators came with assumptions and preconceived solutions. I'm starting fresh, willing to listen to both sides without judgment. Noble words, Magnus said, his voice deeper than Victoria expected, with an edge that suggested violence barely leashed. But words are cheap. The real question is whether you have the spine to stand between us when tempers flare. Whether you'll run the first time someone bares their teeth. Victoria met his amber eyes, directly remembering Natasha's lessons about strength and respect. I've stared down a council of 12 predators who wanted me eliminated. I think I can handle 2 groups with a property dispute. Tension flickered across Magnus's expression. Not quite respect, but acknowledgement that Victoria wasn't going to fold at the first sign of aggression. Hayes, meanwhile, looked unimpressed, but he gestured toward the cabin. Shall we get this over with, then? The cabin's interior was barely better than its exterior. A scarred wooden table dominated the single room, surrounded by mismatched chairs that looked like they might collapse under any serious weight. Victoria took a seat at the head of the table, positioning herself between the 2 groups. Hayes and his men sat to her left, Magnus and his companion to her right, everyone carefully maintaining distance that could become combat space if necessary. Let's establish some ground rules, Victoria said, pulling out the notebook where she'd spent 3 weeks documenting everything she could learn about territorial law, both human and lichen. We're here to find a solution that respects both parties' legitimate interests. That means no threats, no posturing, and no walking out until we've made real progress. Can we agree to that? Depends on what progress looks like, Hayes said. Because from where I'm sitting, the solution is simple. Tri-State Lumber has legal permits from the state government. That forest is ours to harvest. These creatures need to accept that human law supersedes whatever supernatural claims they think they have. Creatures. Magnus repeated it, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Is that what you think we are, Colonel? Animals to be moved aside when humans decide they want something? I think you're exactly what the permits say you are, Hayes shot back. Unrecognized entities with no legal standing. That land belongs to Tri-State, and no amount of howling at the moon changes that fact. Victoria held up her hand before the argument could escalate further. Colonel Hayes, you mentioned Tri-State Lumber has state permits. Can you provide documentation of when those permits were issued and what environmental reviews were conducted? Hayes pulled papers from his jacket, sliding them across the table. Victoria reviewed them carefully, her marketing background, making her naturally attentive to details others might miss. The permits looked official, dated from 6 months ago, with all the appropriate stamps and signatures. But something about the timing bothered her. Magnus, Victoria said, turning to the lichen leacher, you mentioned your pack has territorial deeds. Can I see those? Magnus's companion produced a leather folder containing documents that looked genuinely old. The paper yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. Victoria examined them carefully, noting dates that went back to 1891, when the Silver-Tooth Pack had been granted this territory through some kind of supernatural accord that Victoria didn't fully understand. These territories have been ours for over a century, Magnus said, his tone losing some of its edge as he spoke about pack history. My grandfather's grandfather hunted these woods. Our dens are carved into the mountain you want to clear cut. Our ancestral grounds, our sacred sites, everything that matters to our pack is in that forest. And my company has 20 families depending on those logging contracts to feed their children, Hayes countered. Real people with real bills to pay. I'm sorry if that's inconvenient for your pack's traditions, but human needs come first. Victoria let them argue for another 10 minutes, listening carefully to what was said, and more importantly, what wasn't. Hayes kept referring to Tri-State Lumber in possessive terms, talking about my company and our contracts in ways that suggested more than just a military advisor's interest. And Magnus, despite his aggressive posturing, kept bringing the conversation back to family and legacy, suggesting the pack's connection to this land ran deeper than simple territorial pride. I need to do some research, Victoria said, finally cutting through another round of escalating accusations. Give me 24 hours to review these documents more thoroughly and investigate the timeline. Then we'll meet again. 24 hours to accomplish what? Hayes demanded. This isn't complicated. We have legal rights. They don't. Discussion over. If it were that simple, Colonel, you wouldn't have spent months on the brink of violence. Victoria said calmly. Something about this situation doesn't add up. Give me time to figure out what we're all missing. She dismissed them before either side could object further, watching as they filed out with muttered complaints and suspicious glances. Once alone, Victoria pulled out her laptop and started digging, using every research skill she'd developed working in marketing to trace the paper trail behind Tri-State Lumber. 3 hours later, hunched over her computer with cold coffee and mounting suspicion, Victoria found it. The permits had been issued 6 months ago, but Tri-State Lumber had only formed as a corporate entity 8 months prior. The CEO, Richard Morrison, had a background in resource extraction that included 2 previous companies that had declared bankruptcy under suspicious circumstances. And when Victoria dug into the financial records available through public databases, she found her blood running cold. Tri-State Lumber was hemorrhaging money. The company had taken out massive loans based on projected profits from the Montana logging operation, but those projections assumed they could start harvesting immediately. The months-long delay caused by the territorial dispute meant they were burning through capital with no revenue stream. At their current rate, Tri-State would be insolvent within 3 months. Victoria sat back, her mind racing. This wasn't really about human rights versus lichen territory. This was about a failing company desperate to start operations before their creditors came calling. And if the lichens continued blocking access to the forest, Tri-State would collapse, taking those 20 families Hayes had mentioned down with them. But there was something else, a detail that didn't quite fit. Victoria pulled up the loan documents, examining the signatures and payment schedules. The primary lender was a shell corporation based in Delaware, which by itself wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the payment structure, which seemed designed to extract maximum short-term value while guaranteeing long-term failure. Victoria spent another hour tracing the shell corporation through layers of ownership until she found a name that made her stomach drop. The trail led back to a name she recognized from her 3 weeks at Thornridge, a name that appeared in Marcus's briefings about council politics and factional disputes. Garrett Stone. The counselor who wanted her eliminated had financially backed the logging company at the center of this territorial crisis. He'd set up Tri-State to fail, knowing that failure would escalate tensions between humans and lichens, would prove his argument that humans and supernatural creatures couldn't coexist peacefully, would justify his calls for complete separation and the elimination of any human influences on lichen leadership. Victoria stared at her computer screen, watching the sun set through the cabin's broken windows, and felt rage building in her chest. Stone had sent her here expecting her to fail, expecting her to be caught in the crossfire when negotiations broke down and violence erupted. He'd engineered this entire crisis to serve his political agenda, and Victoria had walked straight into it. But she'd also just found the evidence to expose him. Victoria spent the night compiling documentation, creating a presentation that traced Tri-State's financial backing through every shell corporation and dummy account until the trail led unmistakably to Stone's holdings. By dawn, she had everything she needed to blow open the conspiracy. The question was how to use this information without getting herself killed in the process. Her guards, David and Michael, were both loyal to Marcus rather than Stone, but they were also bound by pack law not to interfere with the challenge unless Victoria's life was in immediate danger. Victoria couldn't rely on them for protection if things went sideways. She needed to handle this herself using nothing but her wits and the evidence she'd uncovered. The morning meeting was tense from the moment both groups arrived. Hayes looked like he hadn't slept, his face drawn and his movements agitated. Magnus appeared calmer but watchful, his amber eyes tracking Victoria with Hunter's focus. "I found something," Victoria said without preamble, connecting her laptop to a portable projector she'd brought specifically for this purpose. "Something that changes everything about this dispute." She walked them through her findings, methodically showing the financial records of the shell corporations, the payments that traced back to Stone's holdings. Hayes's face went from confusion to shock to fury as he realized how completely he'd been manipulated. Magnus's expression remained controlled, but Victoria saw his hands clench into fists on the table. "You're saying someone set this up deliberately?" Hayes demanded, his voice rough with anger. "Set up my company to fail just to create conflict?" "I'm saying Counselor Garrett Stone wanted war between humans and lichens in this territory," Victoria confirmed. "He funded Tri-State knowing the company couldn't sustain operations long enough to be profitable. He wanted you to fail, Colonel, because that failure would prove his ideology that humans and supernatural creatures can't work together." "Why upside down?" Magnus asked, his tone carefully controlled despite the fury Victoria could sense radiating from him. What does Stone gain from this political capital, Victoria said. He leads a faction that opposes human-like cooperation. Every failed negotiation, every violent confrontation strengthens his position on the council. This crisis was designed to be unsolvable, to end in bloodshed that would prove his point. Hayes stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin like a caged animal. My men, the families depending on these contracts. He used us all as pawns in some supernatural political game. Yes, Victoria said quietly, and he expected me to fail at resolving it. Expected you to blame each other instead of looking for the real source of the problem. The cabin fell silent except for Hayes's pacing and the sound of wind through broken windows. Victoria waited, letting them process the implications. She'd given them the truth. Now she needed them to decide what to do with it. Magnus spoke first, his voice heavy with meaning. Victoria wasn't sure she fully understood. If we allow this manipulation to succeed, if we let Stone's machinations destroy human-like relations in Montana, we prove his argument for him. We become the savages he claims we are. And if we back down, Hayes said, stopping his pacing to look directly at Magnus, if we just accept that some council bastard manipulated us, where does that leave my men? Tri-State is still failing. Those families still need income. This was it, the moment where Victoria would either find a solution or watch everything collapse into the violence Stone had been planning for. She took a breath, centering herself, remembering Marcus's words about strength and strategy. What if we remove Stone from the equation entirely, Victoria asked. Tri-State is failing because of predatory loan terms and delayed operations. But what if the pack partnered with a logging company, instead a joint venture that gives Tri-State access to sustainable harvesting while respecting sacred sites and pack territories? The Lycans could use their knowledge of the land to identify areas that can be logged without destroying ancestral grounds. The company gets the revenue stream it needs. The pack maintains control over its territory. Hayes and Magnus exchanged glances, tension shifting to something else. You're suggesting cooperation, Hayes said slowly, between humans and werewolves, running a business together. I'm suggesting that Stone wanted you at each other's throats, Victoria said. The best revenge is proving him wrong. Show the council, show everyone watching this crisis that humans and Lycans can work together when given the chance. That the real problem isn't incompatibility between species, but manipulation by those who profit from division. Magnus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The pack would need guarantees, protected zones where no logging occurs, profit sharing that reflects our territorial rights, and representation on Tri-State's board to ensure sustainable practices. Done, Hayes said immediately, then paused. Assuming my CEO agrees, which he will because the alternative is bankruptcy and explaining to 20 families why they're unemployed. Then we have a framework, Victoria said, hardly daring to believe it might actually work. We formalize the partnership file for permit modifications to reflect the new arrangement, and you both present a united front when Stone's conspiracy becomes public. They spent the next 6 hours hammering out details, occasionally arguing, but mostly working with surprising efficiency now that they understood they'd been set against each other deliberately. By evening, they had the skeleton of an agreement that gave both sides what they needed. Hayes would get his revenue stream, Magnus would protect his pack's sacred territories, and 20 human families would keep their jobs while learning to work alongside Lycans. But the agreement was only half the battle. Victoria still needed to expose Stone's conspiracy publicly in a way that would reach the council and destroy his credibility. That meant gathering physical evidence, not just digital records that could be dismissed as fabricated. It meant finding documents with Stone's signature financial transfers that couldn't be explained away. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Victoria's life. She worked with Hayes and Magnus to solidify their partnership while simultaneously building her case against Stone. She interviewed Tri-State employees who'd witnessed suspicious instructions from the CEO. She tracked down bankers who'd processed the Shell Corporation payments. She compiled testimony from other mediators who'd failed at this very task, all of them describing similar patterns of manufactured crisis. And through it all, Victoria felt the weight of isolation pressing down on her. She spoke to Marcus once a week on monitored phone calls, each a conversation carefully neutral, because they both knew Stone's people were listening. She missed him with an intensity that surprised her, missed their early morning conversations, and the way his rare smiles transformed his severe features. Missed feeling safe in a way she'd never felt safe with Preston because Marcus saw her strength instead of trying to diminish it. The assassination attempt came on her 21st night in Montana. Victoria woke to the sound of breaking glass, her training with Natasha kicking in before conscious thought. She rolled off the bed as bullets tore through the wall where her head had been seconds before grabbed the knife she kept under her pillow and scrambled toward the bathroom. The cabin door burst open. A figure in black moved through the darkness with inhuman speed heading straight for Victoria's position. She didn't think, didn't hesitate, just threw the knife with the precision Natasha had drilled into her over 3 weeks of relentless practice. The blade caught the intruder in the shoulder, not a killing blow, but enough to slow him down. Victoria heard shouting outside, recognized David's voice raised in alarm. Her guards were supposed to be on perimeter patrol, too far away to help immediately. This assassin had timed his attack perfectly, waiting for the narrow window when Victoria would be alone. Victoria didn't wait to see if her throw had been enough. She launched herself at the intruder using momentum and surprise rather than trying to match his strength. They crashed into the table where she'd spent weeks negotiating wood splintering under their combined weight. The intruder recovered faster than she expected, his hand closing around her throat with crushing pressure. Then the door exploded inward. Magnus Ashwood moved with terrifying speed, crossing the cabin in a blur and ripping the assassin off Victoria with enough force to send the man flying into the far wall. The intruder tried to rise, but Magnus was already there, one clawed hand pressed against the man's throat. "Who sent you, bum?" Magnus demanded, his voice dropping to something that made Victoria's hindbrain scream danger. The assassin laughed, blood bubbling from his lips. "You know who sent me. Same person who's been engineering this whole crisis. But it doesn't matter. The human will fail. She'll die here and Stone's point will be proven." "Except I'm not dead," Victoria said, her voice hoarse from the attempted strangulation, but steady. "And I'm not failing. I've already resolved the territorial dispute. Hayes and your pack are partnering. Stone's manipulation failed." The assassin's eyes widened with genuine surprise. "That's not possible. The colonel hates our kind. Would never agree to being manipulated by council politics," Magnus interrupted. "But when he learned the truth, when he understood we were both being used, he chose cooperation over violence, just like Miss Bennett predicted he would." David and Michael burst into the cabin, weapons drawn, their young faces pale with shock at finding their charge bleeding but alive. "We heard the shots," David said, his eyes taking in the destroyed cabin, the assassin pinned against the wall, Victoria's bruised throat. "We came as fast as we could." "Fast enough," Victoria managed, though her legs were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "Is he Stone's man?" "We'll find out," Michael said grimly, moving to secure the assassin, while Magnus backed away, his clawed hand returning to normal human appearance. "And then we'll make sure the council hears about this attack. Stone sending assassins after you during a sanctioned challenge is grounds for expulsion." Victoria sank onto one of the intact chairs, her whole body trembling with delayed shock. She'd come so close to dying. If her training hadn't been good enough, if she'd frozen instead of reacted, if Magnus hadn't chosen to check on her tonight, for reasons she didn't fully understand, she'd be dead. "Thank you," Victoria said to Magnus, meeting his amber eyes. "You didn't have to help me. You could have let him finish and walked away." Magnus studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "3 weeks ago, I thought you were a liability, a weak human playing at diplomacy. But you uncovered Stone's conspiracy. You found a solution no one else could see. You fought an assassin instead of cowering." He paused, respect crossing his features. "You've earned the right to survive this, Miss Bennett. Besides, our partnership with Tri-State depends on you living long enough to present your findings to the council." Victoria laughed, slightly hysterical because, of course, the pragmatic reason would win out. But she saw the truth beneath Magnus's gruff words. He respected her now, saw her as something other than a weak human to be dismissed. That respect had saved her life. The next morning, Victoria stood in the clearing where this had all started, but everything was different now. Hayes and Magnus flanked her, both men wearing expressions of grim satisfaction. Behind them stood representatives from both groups, humans and lichens, together instead of divided by species. "We're ready to present our findings," Victoria said into the satellite phone connecting her to the council chambers at Thornridge. Marcus's voice came through immediately rough with concern. Victoria, are you all right? We heard about the attack. I'm fine, Victoria said, and she meant it. Her throat was bruised, her body ached from fighting, but she was alive. I've got something the council needs to see. Something that's going to change everything. The presentation took 2 hours, Victoria walking the council through every piece of evidence she'd compiled. The financial records tracing Tri-State's backing to Stone's holdings. The testimony from previous mediators describing manufactured crises. The assassination attempt on a candidate during a sanctioned challenge. Hayes and Magnus both provided statements describing how Stone's manipulation had nearly driven them to war. Through it all, Victoria watched Stone's face on the video feed, saw his expression shift from confidence to fury to fear as the evidence piled up. Other council members looked shocked, betrayed, increasingly angry as they realized one of their own had been engineering conflicts for political gain. When Victoria finished, Cordelia Frost stood with measured grace. "Councillor Stone," she said, her voice cold enough to freeze, "you stand accused of conspiracy, of manipulating humans and lichens toward violence for political purposes, and of sanctioning an assassination attempt on a candidate during a council challenge. These are violations of our most sacred laws, violations that strike at the heart of what we claim to value as a community." Stone tried to defend himself, claimed the evidence was fabricated, insisted Victoria was lying to save herself from failure. But the paper trail was too complete, the testimony too consistent. And when the assassin, now secured at Thornridge, confessed that Stone had personally hired him, the last of Stone's support evaporated. "The council votes on your expulsion," Frost announced. "All in favor." 11 hands rose. Only Stone's remained down, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. "Garrett Stone, you are expelled from this council effective immediately," Frost declared. "Your territories are forfeit, your authority rescinded. You will have no further influence over lichen governance in North America." The feed cut to Stone's section, showing guards escorting him from the council chambers while he shouted about betrayal and corruption. Victoria watched him go, feeling nothing but exhaustion and a strange sort of satisfaction. She'd beaten him, not through strength or supernatural power, but through investigation and strategy, and refusing to give up when the situation seemed impossible. "Miss Bennett," Frost said, and Victoria refocused on the council. "You were given 90 days to resolve the Montana crisis. You've accomplished it in less than 30, and in doing so exposed a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of this council. The question now is what judgment we render on your status." Victoria's heart hammered. This was it. The moment that would determine whether she'd won the right to be with Marcus, or whether she'd have to walk away from everything they'd built together. "I vote for full citizenship and recognition," Frost said without hesitation. "Miss Bennett has demonstrated courage, intelligence, and strategic thinking that many lichens would struggle to match. She's earned her place among us." The other council members voiced their agreement one by one until all 11 remaining members had voted in Victoria's favor. Complete unanimous approval, something that rarely happened in council politics. "Victoria Bennett," Frost said formally, "you are hereby granted full citizenship in the lichen community of North America with all rights and protections that entails. Your relationship with Alphaking Marcus Blackwood is officially recognized and sanctioned by this council. Welcome." Victoria felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She'd done it. Survived Stone's trap, resolved an impossible crisis, and earned the acceptance she'd been fighting for. Behind her, Hayes and Magnus were grinning, both men clearly pleased that their partnership had been part of a larger victory. "Thank you," Victoria managed, her voice rough. "I won't let you down." "You already haven't," Frost said, and there was warmth in her expression. "Come home, Miss Bennett. I believe someone is rather anxious to see you." The drive back to Thornridge took 12 hours, but Victoria barely noticed. She slept most of the way, her body finally allowing itself to rest now that the immediate danger had passed. David and Michael traded driving shifts and chatted about the successful resolution, both young lichens clearly relieved they hadn't had to escort Victoria's body back instead of her living self. It was late afternoon when they pulled through Thornridge's gates. Victoria saw Marcus before the car even stopped moving, standing on the front steps with an expression caught between relief and barely controlled desperation. The car had barely stopped when she threw open the door and ran to him, all dignity forgotten in the overwhelming need to be close to him again. Marcus caught her lifting Victoria off her feet and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. His face buried in her hair, his whole body shaking with what might have been sobs if Alpha Kings were allowed to cry. "You came back," he said against her hair, his voice wrecked. "You came back to me. I promised I would," Victoria said, her own tears finally falling freely. "I keep my promises." They stood like that for long minutes, neither willing to let go, both of them processing the fact that they'd made it through, that Victoria had survived Stone's trap and earned her place in Marcus's world through her own merit rather than borrowed protection. Finally, Marcus pulled back enough to cup Victoria's face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "You're magnificent," he said softly. Brilliant and absolutely magnificent. I knew you would be, but seeing it, hearing what you accomplished." He shook his head. "You didn't just survive, Victoria, you won. Completely." "We won," Victoria corrected. "Your training, Natasha's lessons, everything you taught me about Lycan culture and politics. I couldn't have done any of it without you." "But you did do it," Marcus insisted. "You walked into an impossible situation and found a solution no one else could see. You uncovered Stone's conspiracy and exposed him. You created an alliance between humans and Lycans that could change how both groups interact across the continent. That was all you, Victoria. Your mind, your courage, your refusal to give up." Victoria smiled despite her exhaustion. "So what happens now?" "Now," Marcus said, his expression growing serious, "we have a choice to make. The Council has recognized our relationship, which means we can move forward with completing the mate bond if that's what we both want. But that requires transformation, Victoria. Requires you to give up your humanity and accept a 40% chance of death. I won't ask you to make that choice lightly." Victoria thought about the past month, about the way she'd grown and changed, about the strength she'd discovered in herself that she'd never known existed, about the partnership she'd built with Marcus, the way they challenged and supported each other, the electric connection that had only grown stronger with time and distance. "I'm not ready yet," Victoria said honestly. "I need time to process everything that just happened, to understand what I'm really choosing and why. But Marcus, I want you to know that I'm choosing you. However long it takes to be ready for transformation, to be certain, I'm doing this for the right reasons. I'm choosing you." Relief washed across Marcus's features. "Take all the time you need. We have 3 months before the mate bond begins to fade without completion. 3 months to be certain this is what we both want." "Can I have 3 days first?" Victoria asked, managing a weak smile. "To sleep and eat and maybe stop feeling like I'm going to collapse at any moment." Marcus laughed, and the sound was beautiful after so much tension and fear. "You can have whatever you need," he said, lifting Victoria into his arms despite her protest that she could walk. "But I'm not letting you out of my sight for at least a week, possibly a month, possibly never." He carried her into Thornridge, past guards who bowed respectfully, past Natasha, who stood watching with an expression that might have been approval. Up the grand staircase to Victoria's suite in the East Wing, laying her gently on the bed and pulling off her boots with careful attention. "Sleep," Marcus said softly, pulling a blanket over her. "I'll be right here when you wake up." Victoria caught his hand before he could step away. "Stay," she said. "Please, I don't want to be alone." Marcus climbed onto the bed beside her, fully clothed, pulling Victoria against his chest with achingly gentle care. She could hear his heartbeat steady and strong, could feel the solid warmth of his body, could smell pine forests and winter nights. And for the first time in a month, Victoria felt completely, utterly safe. "Thank you," she murmured, already drifting towards sleep. "For believing I could do this?" "Thank you," Marcus said against her hair, "for proving everyone wrong, for being exactly who you are, for choosing me despite everything it cost you." Victoria fell asleep in his arms, dreaming not of assassination attempts or council politics, but of a future that suddenly seemed possible. A future where she wasn't hiding behind anyone's protection, but standing beside someone as an equal. Where her strength was recognized and valued instead of dismissed. Where love didn't require making yourself smaller, but could flourish because both people chose to grow. 3 months, Victoria thought as consciousness faded. 3 months to be certain, to prepare, to choose transformation for the right reasons instead of desperation or fear. She suspected she already knew what her choice would be. But Marcus was right. A decision this permanent, this life-changing, deserved time and consideration and absolute certainty. For now, though, Victoria was content to sleep in the arms of the Alpha King who'd seen her strength when she couldn't see it herself, who'd believed in her capability even when sending her into danger, who'd waited for her return with the desperate hope of someone who'd finally found what they'd been missing. Victoria Bennett had kissed a stranger to forget her pain and found a future worth fighting for, worth transforming for, worth risking everything to claim. And in 3 months, she'd make that future real. Spring arrived at Thornridge Estate with an explosion of color that made the gardens look like something from a fairy tale. Victoria stood before the full-length mirror in her suite, examining the woman reflected back at her. 3 months had transformed her in ways that went beyond the physical training or political education. She'd become someone who could stand before a council of predators without flinching, who could negotiate between armed groups on the brink of war, who could expose corruption at the highest levels of Lycan governance. Tonight she would complete the transformation, not because she had to, but because she'd chosen to. Chosen Marcus. Chosen this life, chosen to become something more than human, because the alternative was living half a life, always apart, always temporary. The full moon rose outside her window, huge and silver against the darkening sky. In the gardens below, the entire pack had gathered for the ceremony. Victoria could see them moving through the grounds with that dangerous elegance she'd learned to recognize, their faces turned upward toward the balcony where she stood. Natasha entered without knocking, carrying the ceremonial robe Victoria would wear. "Ready?" she asked, her sharp eyes searching Victoria's face for any sign of doubt. "Yes," Victoria said and meant it. No hesitation, no fear, just absolute certainty that this was right. The ceremony took place under the full moon, every member of Marcus's pack bearing witness. Victoria knelt before Marcus as he spoke the ancient words, his voice carrying across the silent grounds. When he bit her, his teeth sinking into the junction between her neck and shoulder, Victoria felt the bond snap into place with almost physical force. The transformation took 48 hours. Victoria had been warned about the pain, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of her body remaking itself at a cellular level. Bones breaking and reforming muscles, tearing and rebuilding every system in her body, fighting to accept or reject the change. She survived. When Victoria opened her eyes on the third morning, they were no longer blue but golden amber. When she stood, she could hear heartbeats 3 rooms away, could smell the coffee brewing in the kitchen, could feel power humming beneath her skin like an electrical current. Marcus was there when she woke, as he'd been there through every moment of the transformation. He pulled her into his arms, his relief so profound it made his hands shake. "Welcome home," he whispered against her hair. 6 weeks later, Victoria stood in Thornridge's gardens on a perfect May afternoon wearing white silk that moved like water. Riley stood beside her as maid of honor, tears streaming down her face as she watched her best friend marry a werewolf king. "I always knew you'd do something dramatic," Riley whispered as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "But this is next level even for you." Victoria laughed, squeezing her friend's hand. "Thank you for believing I could survive this, for not trying to talk me out of it. Are you kidding? After you exposed a council conspiracy and resolved a territorial war, I knew you could survive anything." The ceremony blended human and Lycan traditions. Victoria's mother gave her away with tears in her eyes, having finally accepted that her daughter had found something rare and precious. Magnus Ashwood attended with members of the Silver Tooth Pack, their partnership with Tri-State Lumber, now a model for human-Lycan cooperation. Colonel Hayes came with his wife, both of them presenting Victoria with a carved wooden box containing earth from the Montana forest, a symbol of the peace she'd created. Even members of Stone's former faction attended their new leadership, having chosen cooperation over continued conflict. When Marcus lifted Victoria's veil and kissed her, the assembled packs howled their approval, the sound echoing off the mountains and carrying for miles. Victoria howled with them, her new voice joining the chorus, and felt truly home for the first time in her life. 6 months after the wedding, Victoria sat in the chair beside Marcus's elevated throne in the council chambers, her posture relaxed but attentive as the council debated a new territorial dispute in Seattle. She'd been officially installed as Queen Consort 3 months ago, given a voting seat on the council, the first non-born Lycan to hold such a position. The Seattle Alpha is testing boundaries, Cordelia Frost said, directing her comments to both Marcus and Victoria. He claims his pack has been unfairly restricted in their hunting grounds. Victoria leaned forward, her mind already analyzing the situation with the same strategic thinking that had resolved Montana. Have we reviewed the historical boundaries? Sometimes these disputes arise from genuine confusion rather than deliberate challenges. A wise observation, Frost said, and there was genuine respect in her tone now. Perhaps Queen Victoria should lead the investigation given her success with previous territorial matters. Victoria glanced at Marcus, saw the pride and love in his gaze, and nodded. I'll leave for Seattle next week, but this time I'd like to take Magnus Ashwood with me. His experience with the Montana Partnership could be valuable. The council voted unanimously in favor. As the session ended and members filed out, Marcus took Victoria's hand, threading his fingers through hers. Remember when you stood in this chamber terrified, facing 12 predators who wanted you gone? He asked softly. I remember, Victoria said. I also remember you telling me I was steel-wrapped in silk, that I was stronger than I knew. I was right, Marcus said, pulling her close. You've become everything I knew you could be. Queen, warrior, diplomat, partner, everything. Victoria rose on her toes to kiss him, tasting home and forever in the contact. I kissed a stranger to forget my past, she murmured against his lips, and found a future beyond anything I could have imagined. Always, Marcus asked, echoing the promise they'd made to each other during their wedding vows. Always, Victoria confirmed, forever. Outside the council chambers, the sun set over Thornridge estate, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, a wolf howled, and Victoria felt the urge to answer, to join the song of her pack, her family, her home. She was no longer the broken woman who'd been betrayed at a charity gala. She was Victoria Blackwood, queen of the North American Lichens, partner to the Alphaking, an architect of a new era where humans and supernatural creatures could build bridges instead of walls. And she'd earned every bit of it through courage, intelligence, and the stubborn refusal to be anything less than extraordinary. The future stretched before her, full of challenges and triumphs, conflicts and resolutions. But whatever came next, Victoria would face it as she'd faced everything else. With strength, with strategy, and with the unshakable certainty that she belonged exactly where she was.